the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk live. It's episode 395. This is a solo show, and in a different spot than we normally are. This is Jess Root, your host from cardswire.com, the Arizona Cardinals site from the USA Today NFL Wire. I'm not at home this weekend. I'm in Lubbock, Texas, visiting my son after he had an incident, and so I'm in his apartment late at night on a Saturday night, but there's some stuff to talk about. And I'll take care of that while we will have another show Sunday night, which will publish on Monday, and then on Tuesday night, which will publish on Wednesday. This is episode 395, and it is about the Arizona Cardinals coaching situation. We'll go ahead and get started. And basically, we have three topics to discuss. One is a report from the Pro Football Network. It came from out at the Senior Bowl at Mobile, Alabama, and it was about the coaching situation and Kyler Murray. Basically, that Kyler Murray is the problem, and that is why some of the coaches haven't wanted to coach the Cardinals this year. Some of the candidates have some hesitation about Kyler being the guy and having that contract for the next 4 years. It's very interesting because most coaches want a young quarterback that they can work with. Now, there are some whispers about Kyler, about his work ethic, about the video games and this and that, his preparation. However, if we go back to high school, if we go back to college, no coach has ever complained about his preparation. His practice mentality is intense. He wants to practice hard. And there might be something to the fact that he isn't as coachable as some might think, but we can also look at the situation with Cliff Kingsbury as not being great in that last season. There was a report, as we recall, that said that Kyler's negativity was starting to get to people. Kyler's an intense individual, and there's nothing wrong with that. He's super competitive. He wants to win, and he's not warm and fuzzy, but he's never been that way. I find it hard to believe that legitimate head coaching candidates would be wary about a guy like Kyler Murray, especially with the performances that he's put up before last year. If we go back to his rookie season, rookie of the year season, definite promise there. Go to 2020, there was in the middle of the season, 4 or 5, 6 game stretch where he looked like a legitimate MVP candidate. It didn't start that way. It didn't end that way. And then in 2021, the first half of the season, he was arguably the best player in the league. He was an MVP favorite at that point. Injuries to him, injuries to the team, led to some inconsistent play late in the season. And then we go back to this last season. This last season wasn't a good one for Kyler. It was a struggle. He was not nearly as effective as he was in the deep passing game. He dealt with injuries himself. There were scores of injuries on the team, on the offensive line. He never had DeAndre Hopkins, Marquise Brown, and Rondale Moore in a game together. Hopkins obviously was suspended for 6 games. Then just before Hopkins came back, Marquise Brown injured his foot. Rondale Moore was on and off the field all season. Zach Ertz got hurt late in the season. And so his weapons were limited. And so his play, there's no excuse. His play wasn't as good. He wasn't as good down the field. He missed more throws. He had a wrist injury in camp. He caught COVID, so he missed practice reps that way. He didn't participate in much of the offseason program because of his contract situation. And so there's a lot of things that go into that. That said, you'd have a hard time believing that a coach wanting to get a head coaching job would be leery about a guy of Kyler's talent. There's only 32 head coaching positions in the NFL. Many candidates have taken jobs with worse quarterback situations. For example, now granted, Brian Daboll of the New York Giants, Mike Kafka, who is one of the candidates, his offensive coordinator, worked with Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones has not shown what Kyler Murray did, and Daboll managed to take the Giants to the postseason with Daniel Jones performing at his highest level. You would think that an NFL head coach or someone wishing to be an NFL head coach would love to see that talent embraced and take it as a challenge to be able to take him to that next level. So, granted, I will say this. The network that is breaking this story is not one that's known to break Cardinals stories. And so I don't want to just consider the source, but we haven't heard this from other national reporters who honestly don't have any issue with reporting things that are negative to Kyler Murray. As there seem to have been things each and every offseason that come out that cast Murray into a negative light. We'll go back to last season, the Chris Mortensen report about him being a bad teammate, a finger pointer, selfish, immature. Most recently in Rappaport's report I think it was last week, talking about how Kyler Murray was going to take his time from his injury when, from both other sources, including Seth Cox, who normally is one of the co-hosts on the show, said that does not come from the Kyler camp. Kyler Murray's camp is saying that they're going to believe that he could come back for the start of the season. And while the report that he might not be back by the midseason makes it sound like he is taking his time when he wants to get back on the field. So it's going to be an interesting thing to see how that moves forward and how Kyler responds this next season to new coaching, a different philosophy, a different offensive system. Personally, I'm excited to see it. There was the balance when Cliff Kingsbury was hired of giving Kyler an offensive system he was familiar with. But at the same time, he has the talent that you believe that he could thrive in any offensive system, and one that perhaps is slightly more complex. We'll see what happens in that. But coming next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of our Cardinals talk on the web, let's talk about the 3 candidates that there appear to be finalists. The Cardinals have second interviews with 3 candidates. That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of our Cardinals talk on the web. And over the last few days, we now have 3 candidates who seemingly are the finalists for the head coaching job. 2 of them came from the new batch of candidates that were interviewed for the first time this last week. It appears Vance Joseph is out, even though that there are some reports saying that he is still a viable candidate to be their head coach. Considering some of the defensive staff is already out, Charlie Bullen taking another job at the University of Illinois. It feels like, and the fact that Vance Joseph has not been mentioned among the candidates who would get a second interview, not that they necessarily would need a second interview with him, but it feels like if Vance Joseph were a viable candidate, he would have already been hired. And so I don't think he's necessarily in the running to be the head coach, although I do think that there's a possibility that he could, and that ownership would like him to remain on staff. That said, the first candidate that we heard late in the week was going to get a second interview is defensive coordinator of the Lions, Aaron Glenn, who was the candidate that seemed to be kind of out of left field. That said, it makes a good fit. I mean, he's a former player. He's been in the league for a while. He's been a defensive coordinator the last 2 seasons. As a coach, he's known as a great leader. He's hard-nosed. He knows the Murray family, like the Texas guy. Dan Campbell, head coach of the Lions, spoke glowingly of him, said they would hate to lose him, but he coaches well. Like he isn't just a defensive guy. He knows how to balance different sides of the ball, different phases of the game, and be a leader of men. And so Josina Anderson, CBS Sports, was the one to report that he was expected to meet again with the Cardinals. There was nothing concrete with that. On Saturday, though, there were 2 reports of candidates that will get second interviews. The first being a defensive coordinator for the Cincinnati Bengals, Lou Anarumo, that is, who interviewed for the first time this last week on Wednesday. Seth and I talked about Anarumo and kind of his situation on our last show, our Tuesday night show that was published on Wednesday. An interesting candidate, 30 years of coaching experience. You know, he goes back to 1989 in the coaching ranks, although he was not in the NFL until 2012. And most of his time has been with one team, with the Miami Dolphins. He was with the Dolphins from 2012 to 2017 as a defensive backs coach. He coached defensive backs for the New York Giants in 2018. Has been the defensive coordinator for the Bengals for the last 3 seasons under Zach Taylor. He's done some really nice things. He's known as a good leader. The part that's interesting with him is that we don't necessarily know what his offensive staff will look like. There's a couple of names out there we can talk about probably on the next show. But he is the guy that if you watch Twitter and social media, that a lot of the national and local reporters seem to be, hey, keep an eye on this guy. I'm not as sold on that because of something that I'm getting the feeling is important. We'll talk about that in a bit. I'll address that bit a bit, but so you've got 2 defensive guys in Aaron Glenn and Lou Anarumo. There was one offensive guy that appears to be a finalist, and unless there are candidates on the 2 Super Bowl teams that they would like to consider, the Cardinals are down to 3 finalists. The third one would be New York Giants offensive coordinator Mike Kafka, who to me is the most intriguing, especially when you have a young quarterback. Kafka has been in the NFL coaching ranks since 2017, but he comes from he worked with Andy Reid 2017 to 2021. He worked with the Kansas City Chiefs, and you like who he's worked with. Under Andy Reid, he was quarterbacks coach for Patrick Mahomes 2018 through 2021. You have to note that the work that Patrick Mahomes has done at quarterback, granted, he might be the most special player we've seen at the position. He's a game changer. Kafka was his coach. And the last 2 seasons, 2020 and 2021, he was the passing game coordinator as well. Fast forward to 2022, Brian Daboll, new head coach for the New York Giants, who previously had not worked with Kafka, hired him to be his offensive coordinator and offensive play caller. So he called plays for the Giants in 2022 and coached Daniel Jones, who had his best season as a pro. Seth and I talked about Kafka's work with Daniel Jones. He didn't have gaudy numbers, but he set career highs in passing yards and in rushing yards. He had his highest passer rating, yards per attempt, and the fewest interceptions of his career. In fact, he had a league low 1.1% interception percentage and fumbled the ball the least times in his career. He was a much more effective player in 2022. But it appears we're down to 3 candidates, like I said, unless there's another one, and unless Vance Joseph is a viable possibility. And it comes down to Aaron Glenn, Lou Anarumo, and Mike Kafka. Of those 3, I'm most intrigued by Kafka. You bring him on, it kind of is the same blueprint as you have in hiring a guy like Cliff Kingsbury, only he's been in the coaching ranks and he's coached NFL quarterbacks and he's coached NFL quarterbacks at a high level. He's been an offensive play caller, so he could be that guy for Kyler Murray for years down the road, and you don't have to worry about the offensive play caller getting hired away in a year or 2 years, and so you don't have to replace that. That was one of the Cardinals' priorities back in 2019 when they hired Cliff Kingsbury with a young quarterback, is because you didn't want to put that young quarterback through multiple offensive systems. And you hire a defensive guy, you're going to have an offensive coordinator who, if he succeeds, will get head coaching opportunities. And so if you go with Kafka, that would keep things stable. He's coached the best quarterback in the NFL in Patrick Mahomes. And we've seen what he's done with him. Daniel Jones improved. And Kyler Murray would be, you'd have to figure that Murray would respond well to him in an offensive system like that. Now, the offensive system is much different than what Cliff Kingsbury ran. If you watched the Giants last year, they were run heavy, but that in part was because they had Saquon Barkley. And you obviously can do more. So he's worked with Patrick Mahomes, who is someone special to say the least. But so it sounds like, again, our three finalists, Aaron Glenn, Lou Anarumo, Mike Kafka, 2 defensive guys, 1 offensive guy. The 2 defensive guys got question marks of who's going to be their offensive coordinator, who's going to be their offensive play caller, and who's going to be the backup in case that guy is hired away in a year or 2 years. Coming next on the Rise of C Red podcast, the best our Cardinals talk on the web, let's talk about one last thing, and that is the role of Vance Joseph moving forward. Is there a place for him, and is that kind of the goal of the team? That's coming next on Rise of C Red. We're back on the Rise of C Red podcast, the best our Cardinals talk on the web, and Vance Joseph's name continues to come up locally and nationally as a viable head coaching guy. It doesn't feel like that would be the case, as I mentioned before, because if Vance Joseph were viably a head coaching candidate, you'd think that because he's the guy in the room you already know what he's about. You probably would have hired him already, unless they're just really being extensive and deliberate in this process, which appears they're taking their time. It doesn't sound like we're going to have a head coaching hiring announced before the Super Bowl. It could happen, but with Anarumo's interview coming on Friday, so unless that comes Friday, Saturday, the Cardinals might not announce a new head coach until after the Super Bowl next week. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But the things that keep coming up with Vance Joseph, he's a viable head coaching candidate. The local guys talk about how they think it's going to be Vance. The report that came from ESPN, a head coaching buzz, the coaching hiring buzz that came out, Dan Graziano, Jeremy Fowler, both mentioned Vance Joseph. I can't remember, one of the two did, I don't remember which one, spoke about the relationship that Joseph has with Michael Bidwell. It's a good relationship. If we look back, now granted, Bruce Arians was allowed to bring on his own defensive coordinator. Steve Wilkes was allowed to bring on his own defensive coordinator. But go back to Ken Wisenhunt. They kept Clancy Pendergast, a defensive coordinator they liked, on for the first couple of years. And then they were, at least the first year, and then were let go. Vance Joseph received a 2-year contract extension last offseason. So he's still under contract for this coming season. He wants to be here. He wants to stay in the Valley. He likes the job here. He likes where his family is at. We saw that in Hard Knocks. With the amount of time that the Cardinals are taking to hire a head coach, it almost feels like, and I'm not the only one to feel this way, that they want Vance Joseph to stick around. Of the 3 candidates that are left, only one makes sense if that's going to be the case. And it might not be a bad pairing. And that would be Mike Kafka. Mike Kafka doesn't have a defensive guy. You could maintain some of the defensive continuity. Whether that's a good or bad thing, the Cardinals were bad statistically on a lot of metrics defensively last season, but they also did some good things, and there's a lot of reasons why they struggled. The offense was missing pieces. They had injuries. They didn't have a true pass rusher. They didn't have a great pass rusher on the squad last year on the edge. They had cornerback issues. They had cornerback injuries. They dealt with injuries all season. And so the defensive line dealt with injuries, and you got some good stuff from J.J. Watt. And we saw late in the season that the defense could perform at a high level. However, second half of games, they would fall apart. They just didn't have the energy, the juice, the horses to be able to do that. That said, a Mike Kafka, Vance Joseph pairing would be like Cliff Kingsbury 2.0, only that Kafka has ties in the NFL. You could have him come in, revamp the offense, and then he's never been a head coach, so Vance Joseph continues to be a calming influence. He gets to coach the defense. We still get to see a lot of the same things defensively, schematically, as we did last season, only with the potential of adding a big-time defensive player at the top of the draft. And so it feels like if I were to pick my favorite, not because it's my favorite, because I think it's the way it's going to go. Be prepared for a Mike Kafka, Vance Joseph pairing in 2023. And allowing Joseph to at least play out his contract. If he does well, they can continue. Or if things don't go as well, then you let him go, and Mike Kafka then can bring in his own guy. What wouldn't make sense is if Anarumo or Glenn were hired, whether Vance Joseph would remain on staff as a defensive coordinator. Anarumo is a possibility, although you would think that he, being a defensive coordinator, would be the guy to coordinate the defense before, kind of like how Cliff Kingsbury handled the offense and so on and so forth. That said, Anarumo was on the Miami Dolphins coaching staff as a defensive backs coach when Vance Joseph was the defensive coordinator last year. Vance Joseph has a background in defensive backs. So does Anarumo. Perhaps Anarumo would keep Vance on as his defensive coordinator, kind of in the role of to blend the two defensive philosophies together, because the Cardinals ran a lot of 4-3 last year. Let's be honest, the way they used Isaiah Simmons, it made it look like they had kind of a 4-3 look for much of the season. And so that's basically it. We've got some thoughts about the situation with Kyler Murray. We've got 3 finalists, it feels like. And lastly, we've got how Vance Joseph might be in play for the defensive coordinator position. Mike Kafka makes a lot of sense. Lou Anarumo makes a little bit of sense. Aaron Glenn, not so much. But we've got another show coming up soon. Sunday night, Seth and I will be back, and we will talk about, we'll start going draft, so it's going to be Seth heavy. Talk about the performances at the Shrine game on Thursday. And then on Tuesday night, we will have Justin Higdon along with Seth Cox, and we will discuss the Senior Bowl, the highlights and the players from that. So we'll be back in a couple days. This is the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour Cardinals talk on the web. I'm Jess Root from cardswire.com. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up Sea Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise Up, Sea Red.